Pak Marty. Of course, I think Pak Marty does not need further introduction. We all know that Pak Marty was a former foreign minister of Indonesia. He was in office between 2000 and can I get it correct? I think it's 2009 to 2014, right? Yes. And then he was also the permanent representative of Indonesia to the United Nations between 2007 and September to October 2009. And he was also Indonesian ambassador to the United Kingdom in London before that as well. And Pak Marty went to school at Ellesmere College and Concord College in the United Kingdom from 79 to 1981, in which Pak Marty earned BSc at the London School of Economics in 1984, and then continued his study in which he received a Master of Philosophy in 1985, and also obtained his doctoral degree at the Australian National University in 1993. He was conferred an honorary doctorate in international relations from the University of Cambodia in 2010. I think that's all about his academic achievement that I try to collect online, of course. Try to gather this information for all of you. And the topic that we are going to discuss today is about Indo-Pacific. And I remember, I think that time, Pak Marty is, of course, the right person to discuss about this issue, in which I remember the term of Indo-Pacific and the term of Treaty of Amity and Cooperation in the Indo-Pacific was also coined in ASEAN by Pak Marty at that time in ASEAN level. I think that would be from my side with regard to the introduction. Without further ado, I'd like to over the microphone, although we don't have an actual microphone, to Pak Marty. Welcome, Pak Marty, and the stage is yours, Pak.
Brilliant. Selamat pagi. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Sesuai permintaan dari pihak penyelenggara, kami akan menyampaikan pandangan kami dalam bahasa Inggris. Very good morning, dear friends and colleagues. Truly delighted to have this opportunity to share some thoughts, some ideas, and hopefully even compare notes amongst us all on a subject matter that I think should be of great pertinence and great importance to all of us. Today, I'd like to share some thoughts about the notion of geopolitical shifts in the Indo-Pacific. But more specifically, I'd like to draw our attention and draw our focus on how the shifts in geopolitics in our region impact or illustrate the nexus, the connection, the connectivity between the economic realm and the political security domain. I do sincerely believe that ours is an age where interlinkages is the key phenomenon, and on the one hand, all of us are trained and are used to think about matters within certain silos, even distinguishing between the economic domain, the political security domain, finance, trade, and other domains. When in fact, in my belief and in my opinion, these domains and these areas actually connect with one another, and there are interlinkages. And specifically today, I'd like to focus on how geopolitics impact on the economy, even not only the economies of countries, but also even at the lower level of businesses and enterprises, perhaps. Certainly, when we are following the news nowadays, we can see, even over the past week, events of significant developments. We saw over the past few days, for instance, the countries of the G7 meeting in the United Kingdom, immediately followed soon after by the meeting of the NATO leaders in Brussels. And today, as we speak, we are to witness a very important summit between the Russian Federation and the United States. In other words, day in and day out, we are witnessing and observing important events, important geopolitical moments. But what is our main takeaway from that? How do these developments impact, if at all, to our day-to-day endeavor? And this is what I'd like to, I'm not pretending that I can provide answers, but at least to encourage all of us to think about the questions and to ponder how relevant they are to our daily undertaking. I did speak just now of a world marked by connectivity, a world marked by linkages, and by this I mean a world whereby the traditional distinction between issues, economic, political, trade, finance, environment, are actually becoming increasingly enmeshed together, difficult to separate, not only between issues, but also between levels. Traditionally, we are used to think about, when we think of governance, about local, national, regional, and global levels. But actually, in many cases, in many instances, we are reminded that all these, while important and significant and useful tools of analysis, in many cases, they all converge together. One obvious example, and I think all of us would probably recognize this fact, is the experience of the pandemic, the COVID pandemic we are witnessing and going through as we speak. The pandemic, the COVID pandemic, is all at the same time. It is a public health issue. Clearly, that is the most evident and obvious illustration of importance. But it is also an economic phenomenon. It has an impact on economies, not only on countries' growth pattern, but often forgotten, perhaps, the impact on poverty alleviation. Almost overnight, we have seen a rise in the incidence or prevalence of poverty all around the world as a result of the pandemic. We are seeing the impact of the pandemic on the environment, its linkage with the environment, with the climate change. There is a school of thought, quite a sound one, I believe, that connects this phenomenon of the pandemic with environmental degradation and the violence that we are committing against our environment. It has an impact, the pandemic, on public education, for instance. For well over a year now, many of us, including school children, are resigned to going to school in this manner, in this digital format, if they have an access to digital platform. Digital divide is a real phenomenon. It's not all of us has an access to digital platform. And if schooling is now done principally through digital platform, for those who are not able to access that platform, you can well imagine the potential generational impact of the pandemic on the well-being of our future generation. It has an impact on technology, accelerating digitalization, reminding of digital divide. It has an impact on governance. We are seeing some governments, some authorities, some governments more adept and more able to respond to the pandemic than others. And there seems to me like a red line, a common thread, whereby governance, science-led response, recognizing that health is the core issue, seems to be a rather important approach to take. Not only on governance, we have the impact of the pandemic on geopolitics, on diplomacy, on multilateralism. In other words, basically what I'm trying to say is that the pandemic reminds that while it is first and foremost a health issue. At the same time, it has many facets and many manifestations, and how not only in terms of consequences, but also in terms of solution. We try to solve one problem, but it can open up a Pandora's box and create problem in another sector. But it's not only the pandemic. I can well cite other examples such as climate change, multifaceted impact, multifaceted manifestation, democracy. We are seeing changing democratic dynamic architecture in our region. In a way, I think it's quite fair to say democracy in retreat in much of our region. In Myanmar is a clear example of how local development in Myanmar, local quickly becomes national, regional, and global as well. Cyberspace. The cyberspace has been in many cases weaponized. Cyberspace is no longer simply a domain for communication to take place, but with the necessary intent, it can become weaponized and become yet another platform, yet another forum whereby interaction and competition among states can be conducted. But specifically today, the nexus that I wish to highlight on is on the economy and political security nexus, because there are many nexuses, many interlinkages that I tried to cite just now. And this interaction or this connectivity between the two domains is one that is long recognized. It is not something that is new. When you think about it, for instance, there is a very sound school of thought that says peace and stability, security, peace and stability is a prerequisite for development. Economic development, economic prosperity would not be able to take place in a sustained manner without the prerequisite political security stability. That is a well-known thesis. And vice versa, there is the thesis that says that sustainable peace can only be sustained with conditions conducive, including economic justice, economic sense of equitable economic development. Not only in that manner, we have long recognized the security-economy nexus in terms of economic interdependence. There is a school of thought that believes that as countries become more interdependent, more economically engaged, this school of thought believes that they become more peaceful with one another, that they are less likely to go to war, to enter into conflict with one another. These are just theses to be proven, to be studied, to be analyzed. And there is another dimension or another nexus whereby economic instruments are being used for state foreign policy, sanctions, boycotts, and the like. And this has become increasingly common nowadays, countries using economic instrument as punishment, as a driver, as instrument to motivate change in the other's behavior and conduct. In short, there are different facets and different ways that we can think of how the economy and the political security domain interact with one another. The geopolitical dimension, if I may turn to that specifically, I use the term geopolitical shifts. By this, I mean, I would like to illustrate the notion that geopolitical shifts and change is permanent. There is not a moment in time when we can simply freeze frame and make static a certain power configuration. Geopolitical dynamics, the ebb and flow of countries' relations constantly change. Change is permanent. So the task for all of us is how can we manage that change? How can we factor in the reality of this very complex, constantly changing geopolitical relationship and dynamics. And our region, the Indo-Pacific, is a case study of such a constantly changing geopolitical dynamics. If you think about it historically, all the way from the outbreak of the Second World War, the East-West Cold War conflict, our region in the Indo-Pacific, widely defined, has been a region that has gone through several competing major power rivalries. There's never been any moment in time in our region when there is one overwhelming, predominant power in our region. It has always been a region marked by continuous contest between major powers. But the major powers may change, the identity of the countries may change, but the dynamic remains. It is a permanently shifting geopolitical environment. And today, as we speak, I can very quickly illustrate some of the prevailing dynamics in our region. And first and foremost, obviously, is the US-China rivalries. I think none of us would dispute the fact that we are seeing a very difficult relationship and dynamics between the United States and China, a relationship that is marked by a continuum, on the one hand, in more positive moments, by a cooperative mood, for instance, on climate change. Now and then there is some indication of cooperation, but going all the way from limited cooperation to competition and even adversarial, almost enemy-like relationship. And I think and this dynamic, competitive dynamic between US and the United States and China is one that is here to stay for the foreseeable future. It is likely to remain a rather constant feature, constantly changing, but at the same time a feature in our geopolitical environment. And what is most important, I think, when we think about its nexus, its linkage with the economy, is that how this US-China rivalry is taking many different forms. It is not like the US-Soviet Union rivalry of the past, where it was principally an economic, an ideological political competition. But in the case of US-China, the form and the manifestation of this competition has become increasingly multifaceted. We are seeing, obviously, competition and rivalry in the security domain, but for many of us, it is not only a high politics issues. We are seeing rivalry in the domain of economy, in trade, in finance, in technology, on even I mentioned before, on the pandemic response, there's also been some rivalry between the two sides. So when we think of the manifestation of the rivalry on the economic domain, in the economic domain, it makes the rivalry more direct relevance to countries and even to businesses and enterprise. How are you going to navigate this potential decoupling in US-China economic relationships? For instance, rivalry over the 5G technology, rivalry on cyberspace, on data protection. Sooner or later, countries as entity or even businesses will be posed by that dilemma, how we can navigate this increasingly like a fissures between the United States and China. And we are seeing not only the format and not only the manifestation, security, of course, political domain, definitely, but also economic, trade, commerce, trade rivalries, trade wars, technology, health, but also the domain where it's being projected. A few days ago, as I mentioned before, we saw the meeting of the G7 and then the meeting of the NATO countries. Imagine NATO the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was at one time set up principally to deal with the threat of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. It was a very much a Eurocentric transatlantic type of modality. But at the recent summit in Brussels, China became the main contention. It became a very China-centric exercise. So if NATO is expanding its outreach, for instance, to the Indo-Pacific, as part of its competition now with China, how are we as countries or as businesses, as enterprises to behave? So it is not only ASEAN, for instance, that is now being pulled by the US-China competition, but other organizations, other platforms are also being imbued, are being injected by the same type of rivalry. But the point that I wanted to suggest this morning, today, is that it is not only about US and China when we think about geopolitical shifts in our region. And I will just very quickly run down a list of other geopolitical shifts and geopolitical relationships that are of relevance. For instance, relationship between China and India. These are two major growing economies, right? Geographically to in the proximity of our country, Indonesia and Southeast Asia, whose future development, future dynamics will have a huge impact on our region. Is it principally a partnership, or is it principally a competitive dynamic? There was a time when we see the relationship as being primarily imbued by a spirit of partnership, with some issues to be managed in terms of border issues, for instance, between the two countries. But now that India is being solicited, India is being reached out to by the United States as part of the Quad, vis-a-vis some countries, some people say China, then that dynamic becomes less certain. What is the nature of the dynamic? And before all of us, any one of you start to think, why should we bother? You need only to be reminded that the importance of China as an economy, India as a growing economy, to our Indonesia's economy, for instance. Indonesia's principal export, for instance, of, I don't know, kelapa sawit, is actually to India. So that whatever happens in that country, the two countries' dynamic will have an impact on us. China-Russia dynamics. China and Japan, again, two economies with whom Indonesia has a very strong economic interaction and relationship. The relationship historically has been very difficult, but what is its future trajectory? Japan and Russia, Japan and South Korea, Republic of Korea, China and Australia. We have seen over the past few months, few years actually, how the economic interaction between the two sides have become extremely difficult. In other words, the point that I wanted to say is that it is not only about US and China. That is the most obvious unknown, the most obvious geopolitical shifts that we need to put our focus on and ponder and wonder what are its implications on our economic activities. There are other dynamics that I mentioned before, each with its own drivers, with its own motivations and problems and opportunities. And certainly when you think about the potential flashpoints, actual situations, areas where a minor incident can quickly become a crisis and can even become invoke or provoke accidental conflict. We have plentiful examples in our part of the world. The South China Sea, the East China Sea, cross-strait relations, Korean Peninsula, India, China, even the Southwest Pacific, Pacific Barat Daya, an area that had relatively been quite benign in recent decades, have also become an area for contest between, for instance, US and China. So the point that I wanted to say is that geopolitical shifts, its complex changes and dynamics, uncertainties, fluidity, and the ebb and flow is here to stay. It is part of our architecture. It is part of the world that we are in. And therefore, surely it should motivate us as a country, as businesses, as enterprises, as individuals, to have some degree of concern and to inform ourselves, what does it all mean to us? Does geopolitics matter? And I would like to suggest that it does matter. I mentioned to you before, when we speak about US and China, all of us, businesses included, have to navigate the potential for decoupling between the two economies. Basically, not only for governments, but also businesses to make a decision, investment decision, trade decision, production facilities decision, where to place their bets, almost, how to navigate this schism and this divide. Or even, if you look at it as not as a challenge, but as an opportunity, how one can benefit, in quote, from this reality. Countries like Vietnam, I am informed, have deliberately and purposefully sought incoming investments that had readjust incoming investment from third countries that had readjust to this reality, and then being invited to the country. But most of all, I think, not the basic thesis and the basic idea is that we need to manage the risks. We need to manage the exposure, and this is what I've been doing over in recent past, to think about this in terms of economy and in terms of businesses. I think all of us must have a modality to measure risks, to see what is the constellation, tatanan, what is the exposure of our businesses, of our economy to geopolitical shifts. For instance, in the case of a typical economy, you can say that the transmission is principally trade and investment. So for economy like Indonesia, for instance, we can do a snapshot and see where is Indonesia's principal trade pattern. How does it look? Where are our key engagement? Indonesia actually, to speak factually, trade constitutes, unlike other economies, trade doesn't constitute a major part of Indonesia's gross domestic product. It is a sizable amount. I have to look at the data in front of me later on, but it is still relatively a smaller part of the GNP compared to, for instance, Singapore and Thailand or Malaysia. But still, we have a situation where some of our principal commodities, or whether it be for export or for our import to meet our basic needs, tend to be coalesced and tend to be concentrated from one or two economies. So in terms of geopolitics, we have to be aware of the changing dynamics so that there is no disruption in supply chains, disruption in our market, etc. And likewise, in the field of finance, when we look at the pattern of our investment, direct, indirect investment, when we look at our debt pattern, to whom are we especially exposed towards on, so that we know how to manage the risk and we know how to what to observe and what to prioritize. For instance, in recent, typically, and it's quite a popular sentiment, it's often said, it's often claimed, or it's often aspired that we should import less and export more. It's a very, very valiant and very commendable spirit. But we have to have, in my view, a threshold and a measurement of success. What is the benchmark to say, yes, we have attained what we wish to attain? What are the criteria for that? Are we aiming for autarky, 100% self-reliance? Or how do you declare, how do you measure success? When geopolitical considerations are taken into account, for instance, as an example, then we will need to ensure that our economic exchanges and pattern do not expose ourselves to make ourselves over-reliant from one party. So it could be a situation when our trade, our export, or our import, or our debt, our investment, when we see increasing concentration to one basket, then maybe there is a need for readjustment. And this readjustment will be driven not necessarily by economic, financial, profit motivation, but simply by the need for geopolitical resilience against geopolitical shifts. So the final thought that I want to suggest, I wanted to mention, is that in terms of response, the first suggestion that I made is that issues interlinked with one another. You can't, in the 21st century, you can't assume political, economic, social development, human rights, health domain are separate. They are all one in terms of sources, origin, in terms of impact, in terms of solution. And there is also convergence between local, national, regional, and global issues. They are all enmeshed. We live in a globalized era where the achievement of our national goals and ambitions are being impacted by global developments. That is my first proposition. The second proposition, specifically, there is a nexus, there is a convergence between the economic domain, economic, finance, commerce, and the political security domain. They are very much intertwined. You can look at the connection in many different ways. And I illustrated some of them, but the basic thesis is that they connect. Now the question is, we need to address that reality. And in the Indo-Pacific, the geopolitical domain is dynamic, is extremely complex, not only US-China, but all the other dynamics that I mentioned before, and all of them, sooner or later, or even here and now, impact on our economic activities. But the question I'm asking is, to what extent do we actually take into account geopolitical dynamic in making decisions on the economic space and commerce? Or do we tend to be wise after event? Certain developments occur, or in terms of our economy, and then we say, this is because of US-China, or this is because of emerging economies elsewhere. It's because of some, but surely, as I speak before the School of Government and Public Policy, policymakers must not only be driving using rear view mirror, you're wise after event, but you have to anticipate you have to manage and shape and mold events. And that is why I think it is important for us to be keenly aware about the geopolitical developments, able to prioritize what geopolitical developments matter to us, whether as a country, as a businesses, as enterprises, and then have a response to it. For instance, we will need to have some kind of a early detection modality. We have to distinguish between there's the background noise and the issues that matter. The problem nowadays is not lack of information, it's too much information. So you need to have a very comprehensive and yet manageable way of approaching these issues. And I guess one may, this is more in the political domain, one may wish to develop economic resilience, ketahanan ekonomi against geopolitical shifts and change. But this is easier said than done. Sometimes when economic decisions are being made, whether at the state level or at the business level, the primary motivations are financial, economic, numerical number, mercantilist, to do with numbers. It takes a big ask for someone in a decision-making process to say, oh, wait a minute, it's not all about numbers, about profits and about finance. We need to take into account geopolitical environment dynamic. It's a big ask, but I think in the long run and even in the medium term, it is sound to interject this consideration. And it's not only geopolitics. I can go on and on about environment. This is one of my favorite subjects, ESG, environment, social and governance, how businesses, economic enterprises can be more ESG sensitive, green economy, sustainable economy, economy that is kinder to the environment, that is not hostile and attack and do violence to our environment. But it is a competing demands. And I guess since I'm speaking before the School of Public Policy principally, I guess my appeal is that let's make sure all the elements for sound decision-making have been inputted. You don't want to have a very siloed consideration, only one sector's consideration to the detriment of others. Those are some of the thoughts that I wanted to share, Pak Dio, and I'm very keen to exchange views with some of our listeners. Thank you very much indeed for having me.
Thank you very much, Pak Marty, for the very, I wouldn't say concise, but I think everything that has already been mentioned is a packed of information that is all relevant to us here studying at the School of Government and Public Policy, especially with regard to the changes, with regard to the dynamics. I'm very interested to learn your view, especially that we are equipped with the understanding that the changes in itself is permanent, it's constant, that what countries are now trying to pursue in the global affairs in the Indo-Pacific region will more and more dynamically overlapping and growing in this area. And I'd like to take two notes from the point of view with regard to Pak Marty. The first is that we, especially from the point of view of students here at the School of Government and Public Policy, that issues, when we discuss about issues in the global affairs, we cannot take one issue without considering the others, especially, for instance, nowadays, when we want to discuss about business, we have to discuss, for instance, also human rights. The topic of environment, the topic of sustainability is all taken into account when it comes to global affairs. And the second point that Pak Marty mentioned would be in the longer or medium term, we also cannot discuss all about security or politics or economics. Do I get it right, Pak Marty? It's not only about the interest that we would like to achieve, but also to adapt to the changing of the geopolitical environment that we are now facing in this 21st century. So now we are entering the question and answer sessions. We already have a couple of questions entered in the chat box. I noticed that this questions posed to Pak Marty is all related to Indonesian view. I think this is also because with regard to your experience, Pak, in the past as former foreign minister. Before entertaining the questions to Pak Marty, I'd like to open the floor. If any one of you in the panelist room would like to ask questions to Pak Marty directly.
Sure.
Are there anyone who'd like to ask questions? You are welcome to do so.
Yep.
Yes. Okay. We have the first would be Pak Noto Suneto. You may open your video and your microphone, and you may have the floor to ask Pak Marty directly. Please.
Thank you so much, Dio. Good morning from the UK, Pak Marty. So it's 3 a.m. here. Apologize, I cannot turn on my camera because it's 3 a.m. at phase. But anyway, thank you so much for the insightful presentation or your remark. I'm currently analyzing about Indonesia's economic diplomacy and very much interested to follow up your statement on the needs to adjust our foreign economic policy based on not only market and economic motivation, but also a need to address geopolitical resilience or the geopolitical developments. And you were asking about to what extent geopolitical dynamic affect the decision on foreign economic policy. My question is, I also read the annual statement of Foreign Minister Retno in 2015 compared to 2020. In 2015, for example, the economic diplomacy is very much articulated and related to Indonesia's ambitions to develop global maritime fulcrum. But in 2020, we don't see that anymore. It's all about investment, it's all about trade, economic partnership, it's about FTA. So do you think that Indonesia is very much concerned on domestic politics or the domestic priorities of President Jokowi and the administration compared to geopolitical developments? And second, what is the main difference of a foreign ministry or foreign policy under your leadership compared to the current foreign ministry on economic diplomacy? Because we see that now, we see that it's pretty much highlighted as a priority, but in your term, I'm sure it's very important as well, seeing your remark, listening to your remark, but what's the main difference? And the first question, again, I'd like to reconfirm, do you agree if we are very much concerned on domestic politics compared to the geopolitical developments on foreign economic policy? Thank you.
If I may, can I just quickly answer this question first, Pak Dio, before I forget?
Sure, of course, Pak.
Yes, sorry, thank you for following our streaming in the middle of the morning in the UK. I hope I haven't made you even more sleepier than would otherwise be the case with what I had just. But I will take on the second question first because it's the easiest one for me to respond to. Because my answer would be I leave it to other parties to evaluate and to make their own to draw their own conclusion. It's not for me to self-describe how things were and how things are, and I leave it to third parties to do that. Except to state as a matter of common statement that foreign policy is a process. Of course, it's marked by change and also marked by continuity, and so there is always a constant management of that two realities or two dynamics. But again, the second question I think is best addressed by someone else. On the first question. Yes, I think your question allows me to elaborate on what I mean by the local, national, regional, and global convergence, because throughout this morning, just now, I spoke more on the convergence between economy as an issue, and political security, geopolitics as another issue. But the convergence that I'm being drawn to is the other one that I mentioned, the levels, local, national, regional, and global. And the thesis or the proposition I'd like to make is that actually, when we talk of economic diplomacy, it shouldn't, in my view, especially for a country as sizable and as significant as Indonesia, it shouldn't be reduced to a mercantilist commerce diplomacy. There is more to economic diplomacy than selling things. There is more to economic diplomacy than simply opening up our doors to investment. Of course, those are two extremely important, relevant, and substantial, and I can't even describe it anymore, but it is extremely important endeavor. Mercantilist, economic pursuit of trade, increasing trade, investment, etc. But a country like Indonesia have long recognized even the achievement of those very domestic, national-centric proposition is not being done only at the local level, national level. It requires a conducive regional and even a global atmosphere, environment. And therefore, even as we concentrate on our national endeavors, we must also at the same time be working at the regional and global level. It is not an either or. It is not as if we can whistle and walk at the same time. We can multitask. Indonesia is a country, even at the depth, deep during our early formative years in 1955, Indonesia convened, imagine this, an entire Asia-Africa continental summit, Asia-Africa, when our economy was in shatters. Our economy was in a bad way, but even then, we realized it can't simply be us doing trading here, doing trading there. We realized we need to change the bigger picture. That is our philosophy. That is our foreign policy. We are bigger than simply economic trade, investment indices. Yes, of course, those are very important, but we can do both. We can strive to achieve even the achievement of our national ambitions can only be done within a conducive atmosphere. And to bring home the message, next year, yes, 2022, if I'm not mistaken, Indonesia will be chairing the G20. And the year after, Indonesia will be chairing ASEAN. Back to back. The G20 chairmanship is a once in every 20 years opportunity. Satu kali dalam 20 tahun kesempatan itu. ASEAN, once in every 10 years, once in a decade opportunity. Now, we have an opportunity to provide a template to shape and mold the world, the regions, economic architectures, development, shape and form. When we are chairing the G20 and ASEAN, would it suffice for us to simply speak about our investment opportunities, trade potentials, etc.? We can't be. To chair is to lead. Chairmanship and leadership is not always the same thing. So when I mention about all this geopolitical environment and development, we, Indonesia, as chair of ASEAN and as chair of G20, can find itself in the epicenter of global geopolitical developments, not of its own doing, not of its own liking. So you can't switch off and say, we will concentrate only on the economy, trade, investment, tourism. Geopolitics, economic diplomacy is more than commerce diplomacy. Yes, commerce diplomacy is part and parcel, very important, probably high at the forefront, but it needs conducive atmosphere. That is why in the past when we had APEC, when Indonesia was chairing APEC 2012, when Indonesia was chairing ASEAN 2011, some of you may be aware of the format RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. It was Indonesia's initiative in 2011 that was came into being only last year. It took more than a whole decade before initiative until the idea becomes to fruition. But the point that I wanted to say is because of Indonesia's thought leadership, kepemimpinan pemikiran, the influence and the impact of Indonesia's economic diplomacy shaping and forming is felt all the way for the 10 years and many decades to come. This is what I wish all of us to think about. Yes, of course, we need to be internally consumed, internally driven, prioritizing, but there is a whole world out there for Indonesia to shape and mold, to have an impact on. And the next 2 years will provide an ample opportunity, the G20 and the ASEAN Chairmanship. Yes, therefore, I'm a little bit, you can sort of guess, I'm a little bit concerned if economic diplomacy is simply being reduced to commerce only. I'm not saying they're not important. We must look at the figures. I guess beyond the slogan, just look at the numbers. What happened to our trade, to our investment over the past 20 years? And you can see the ebb and flow. Does it correspond to the slogan? Does it correspond to the rhetorics? As I said, I leave it to the third-party analysts to look at it rather than for me to speak. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Pak Marty. On the second row now we have Mbak Melanie Fahriantini to deliver her question. Please, Mbak.
Yeah, thank you, Mas Dio. Good morning, Pak Marty. Sorry, I cannot turn off my camera due to the unstable network here. So my name is Lani and I'm a student in SGPP. So well, my question is actually based on the observation as I am dealing quite a lot with the Indonesian government since I work in international development. So I would like to hear your opinion, first of all, regarding your explanation. So I totally agree that nowadays, in terms of you working silo in one sector that dealing only with your KPI, for example, but I don't think we should or I can see any significant evidence that the government has, what do you call it, as a blueprint or a holistic approach to connect it all the sectors involved towards common goals. You know, like each sector still dealing or busy with their own sector. In terms that I don't think that's really effective, as you explained, that we should have see that that one sector to the another is interconnected, and then I don't think there's a real strategic or even in implementation. Probably there are two things as the reason. One is sometimes the same narrations need a different narrator, right? To explain more or to make others looking in the same path. That's the first thing. Or the second one, probably there's a gap there, whether in the term of the high level policy, the blueprint is already there, but go down to the implementations, probably some gaps there, because or each what you call it, high level officials still think about their own KPI instead of, oh, okay, we should work together to go further to reach the common goal, which is for Indonesia as a holistic. As you mentioned, we shouldn't think about figures in the short term, but okay, this figure should be changed in the future, but the milestones, the strategic, it should be clear. So I would like to hear your opinion, Pak Marty, regarding what should be done, because I know that's the study and everything regarding we should do this and we shouldn't is already there. It's too many, as you mentioned, too many informations. But sometimes which one is more suitable for the improvement? That will be a strategic to even choose the right informations. Thank you, Pak Marty.
Well, thank you very much, Bu. I've actually taken note of what you said, because you have really pinpointed a perennial problem, a constant issue for all of us, not only Indonesia, but in general. How one can promote greater coordination, communication, coordination, cohesion. This is what I guess one of the tasks, one of the main preoccupation of the School of Public Policy, such as that I'm speaking before. But coordination and communication and cohesion is easier said than done. It is extremely difficult to actually realize beyond the physical act of having a meeting. There is bureaucratic inertia. Every entities have their own preoccupations, as you have rightly said, and their own sense of priorities. And this is where I think an entity that is above the fray, above and able to see the forest rather than the individual trees, becomes extremely difficult. Important. And as I said, it's easier said than done. But from what I experienced in the past, it takes, at the individual level, it takes a mindset that has an empathy and a willingness to listen to the other side's view. And this is, again, easier said than done. Often case we are so immersed and so well acquainted and so involved and so informed about our own institutions, position and entities, and we go all out in its pursuance. We don't take a moment to actually look at from the other's perspective, and therefore to go beyond our own comfort zone. And it takes a great deal of confidence and a great deal of humility to be able to do it, and confidence in the force of your own argument, that you are able to open up and to listen. To listen is not weakness. So, I don't know. Sometimes by listening, you are empowering yourself. Actually, in my view, in any decision making, no one has a monopoly of wisdom. Imagine that if you keep on, like I'm doing now, simply talking, you are actually not really absorbing new information and new knowledge yourself directly. But in any meeting setting, I think it is important now and then to demonstrate an ability to listen, to not just to hear, but to listen. Mendengar dan mendengarkan beda. You can hear, but you don't necessarily are listening. And I think this is very important. And it's not only decision making at the national level, at the national level, but also interstate level. And when you are mediating, you have mediation, dispute settlement with third countries. You know your own position, but you need to know the other countries' positions to be able to realize your own aspirations. So I would love to be able to learn from the school what are its model for the most effective decision making. But I guess it is something that we need to be working harder on. Governance matter. We see it on. I'm not talking about Indonesia now. Okay, I'm talking in general. We see all over the world the response to pandemic, for instance, say in the United States during the Trump administration and during the Biden's administration. The whole atmosphere, the way the response to the pandemic is being carried out, totally transformed. All it took was, not all, it took a change in leadership and change in governance governance ethos, engaging, common participation, involvement, common ownership. I think these are important qualities, and I don't know. It's easy, like I said. I don't have an answer specific to the problem, but at least we should begin by identifying the challenge, as you have rightly so, and it will be my homework certainly to reflect further. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Marty. Before jumping to Bli Ananda as the third to deliver his question, we already have questions being sent out in the chat box, and I'd like to entertain the first question by Arista Atmaji, if I may. The question is related to Indonesia's diplomacy. Pak Marty, why Indonesia seems playing a very soft diplomacy, even in ASEAN countries? I'm not the one who's delivering this question, yeah, Pak. In ASEAN diplomacy, I think Indonesia must be strong, especially now with the Rohingya issue. We are very soft. For instance, we know that ASEAN has not yet been appointing the special envoy with regard to Myanmar issue. How do you see and perceive this dynamic of Indonesia's diplomacy in ASEAN?
I'm not one to distinguish diplomacy by way of soft or, I guess, hard diplomacy. My main preoccupation is effective. It must be result-oriented. It is not on the sentiment, because emotion is not policy. Emotion is something that you should keep to yourself as a person, as an idiosyncratic phenomenon. But when you are making policy, you should absolve yourself from emotions. It has to be driven by a sense of purpose. You know what your target is, and you drive towards that target, towards that results in an incessant, terus-menerus, in a resilient, dengan tahan banting, in a patient, dengan penuh kesabaran, dan terus-menerus kita upayakan. Jadi it's not about being soft or being hard, but I think it should be driven by results. And Indonesia's track record in the past in ASEAN speaks for itself. All the key developments in ASEAN, whether positive or overcoming negative developments, have Indonesia's footprint and Indonesia's imprint on it. Indonesia's leadership in ASEAN have been extremely transformative and important. The very setting up of ASEAN, the achievement of the ASEAN Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, the expansion of ASEAN 5 from 5 to 10, leaders such as Bapak Mohtar Kusumatmaja, who just passed away a few days ago, a week ago, more or less, was very transformative in extending ASEAN's membership beyond the 5 to the 10 that we have now. The ASEAN community idea, all of them has Indonesia's footprint. The resolution of conflict situation in Southeast Asia, whether in the Southern Philippines, in Thailand, Cambodia, in the South China Sea, all has Indonesia's footprint and contributions. But the point that I wanted to focus once again, all those have been achieved not at the cost of ASEAN's disunity. Jadi, we need to exercise leadership, but it's a cooperative leadership. Jadi, kemitraan yang sifatnya, kepemimpinan yang sifatnya ada kemitraannya, kepemimpinan yang ada kemitraannya. Jadi, we exercise our leadership and at the same time strengthen ASEAN unity. If out of emotion, out of exasperation, We complain about country A, country B, etc., about in Southeast Asia, and at the same time, we bring the ASEAN house down, imploding. It doesn't serve our strategic interests for the future. Hence, reference to Myanmar was made just now, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not going to speak at length on it, but specifically, no one should pretend that this is an easy issue. It's not an easy challenge. It will take a great deal of political perseverance, persistence, patience, determination, dedication, all that. And diplomacy is not an event, it's a process. It can take consistent efforts. But leadership also means when at the first sign of problem, you can't jump ship. You can't suddenly say, oh, it's getting too difficult, let's attack, for instance, the chairman, or attack, or they are not doing a good job, You should, I think, solve the problem. In 2012, Cambodia was chair of ASEAN. They were quite a challenging and chairman when we had the problem on the South China Sea. And Indonesia was a member of ASEAN. Indonesia wasn't chair of ASEAN. But when ASEAN was disunited because of the behavior, because of the conduct and the policies of the chair of ASEAN at the time, which is Cambodia, did Indonesia or parties in third parties in Indonesia start complaining about the chairman being inefficient, being ineffective, being all over the place? No, we kept quiet, but we fixed it. We immediately fixed it. We fixed it quietly, diligently, informally, 48 hours back to where we were before. So I think it's not about, again, back to the question, it's not about hard or soft or it's not boiled egg, bukan telur, it's not about hard, but it's about effectiveness. And I think Indonesia has demonstrated in the past, and I'm sure today under Ibu Retno's leadership, our foreign policy, we will once again demonstrate the requisite skill and perseverance. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Marty. On the third row, I think Bli Ananda would like to ask his question directly. Please, Bli.
Thank you, Pak Dio. Well, Pak Marty, thank you. You just nudged the nutshell of my question, actually, and I might sound like a broken record, but I say it is a pleasure to hear the wisdom from your perspective, and I think the younger generation needs to understand it, because otherwise we are bound to repeat the same mistakes. Then again, my brief question, if I may, you may have repeated it, or if not, feel free to add so. In the late message of Prof. Mohtar, I do persevere believe that leaders of today are created by leaders of tomorrow. So if it's fine and with you, would you like to shed some lights or share some stories? What are 3 values that you may see fit to be transferred or as a baton touch from those generations to us, in a sense of for us to understand the bigger picture, just to understand that all those values you mentioned, incessant, resilient, patient. So I don't know if you have any stories on Pak Mohtar, or maybe if anyone wants to hear stories on Pak Mohtar. I think my question would be, what are 3 values that you learned from him that we could replicate and instill in our daily sense of either policy making or just live our life as Indonesians? Thank you. That would be from me.
Thank you very much. I will make my response one a bit more Pak Mohtar specific and another more generic. The late Pak Mohtar specific, the point that I wanted to illustrate when I think about the late Pak Mohtar is how he managed to connect and transverse again that local, national, and global. We are all aware how at the time Indonesia through its concept of wawasan Nusantara, archipelagic principle, archipelagic principle, sesuatu Juanda declaration, sesuatu yang dicanangkan dan sesuatu that was declared and being promoted at the national level. But Pak Mohtar and his colleagues at the time saw the recognized that this must be not simply be asserted at the national level, but it must also be earned. It must also earn the respect and the recognition at the global level. And therefore, he worked diligently with like-minded countries, the Philippines and other countries with similar constitution, to fight in the UN Law of the Sea, United Conventions in the Law of the Sea, and hence we have recognition of the idea of the archipelagic principle. The point that I wanted to emphasize there, the lessons learned from that, is that actually how someone is able to translate, to project, and to realize and to fight for and campaign something that is initially internally driven and win recognition and support at the global level. Extremely difficult and a challenging task. But it's not only actually on the wawasan Nusantara, but also on the concept of kawasan bebas senjata nuklir Asia Tenggara, Southeast Asia nuclear weapon free zone. When I first joined KEMLU, DEPLU, and then undertook my PhD degree in Australia, my thesis was on that, on the Southeast Asia nuclear weapon free zone principle. And in the course of my research, I came to realize that the idea was first mooted by Pak Mohtar, was first introduced by Pak Mohtar way before others did, and I included in my thesis. And it happens that Pak Mohtar was one of my external examiner, for the thesis. And I remember having submitted it and having thankfully get a pass successfully defend the thesis. Pak Mohtar subsequently spoke to me and said he didn't realize that he was actually the initiator of that idea, because it has been so long ago that he has actually himself forgotten that he was actually the first one who introduced the idea. To me, it speaks of the person who is not about self-proclaimed celebration and self-consumed, seeking approval, seeking recognition, but diligently just working on what you can achieve and let history speak for itself in decades to come. I think that is a very important quality nowadays, because many tends to be glorifying oneself and trying to seek recognition and approval, when in fact, I guess the main importance is your contribution in terms of for future generations. And to your question in general, there are many qualities. Just now I already mentioned the importance, leadership, the importance of capacity of being able to listen is a very important trait, very important quality. No one pretends or no one assumes you have monopoly of wisdom. So you need to be able to listen, to learn, and to empower yourself, and to surround yourself with capable individuals, and not be afraid of exchanging ideas and views. It makes for better policies. But if you are set in your own ways, tidak tahu dan tidak mau tahu. That is the worst combination. You neither know nor do you want to know. Jadi, this is a very dangerous combination if someone believes he or she has all the wisdom that is needed and unwilling to listen to the views of others. And that can be a very troubling implications on decision making, I think. One final point, in my past work, I'm always informed by my predecessors and informed of the future generation. By my predecessors, by way of realizing the burden of responsibility that I shoulder. My behavior, my conduct, my policies must be up to the expectations of the previous holders of the position. Reputationally, in terms of credibility, in terms of responsibility. Only one person can, for instance, be Minister of Foreign Affairs, can be whatever position. So it is a humbling experience, and you have to have humility that this is only a manna that you are shouldering, and you have to realize whatever problems that you are having, others behind you, before you have encountered similar and even probably bigger problems. But most of all, as I speak amongst the future generation, I am always driven by the future. The principle of don't do any harm. If you don't have the necessary wisdom at this time, at least don't make things worse. Jangan memperburuk situasi. And if you feel, oh, this is beyond you, you say, okay, I think I will say this is for someone else in the future to resolve, to address. But, you want to leave the situation better for the next generation. That's why at the moment, I've been toying with this idea of like a future generation, a council of future generation, whereby key issues to do with the environment, for instance, to do with the management of the economy, etc., that has a multi-generational impact. Surely it deserves to be aired to the next generation, not necessarily next generation already in leadership, but next generation, because they are the one who will feel the consequence of today's decision. That's why I said policy making is a combination of many inputs throughout today. I've mentioned about geopolitics. It could be environment, it could be social issues, governance issues, generational issues. So the input for any decision making is very complex, and reaching a modality that is effective is very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Marty. I think one key point I'd like to drive from the statement of Pak Marty is the key for all of us future leaders to have humility, and there's no monopoly of wisdom. I like that sentence, Pak. Before we jump to other questions, we still have around 12 minutes before we close the session. There's one question in the chat box by Muhammad Saifullah about the courage or the risk about Indonesia's taking all the infighting the tensions that we have in geopolitics, such as infighting China, infighting the US through infrastructure development in Indonesia, starting from the toll road, the development of ports, and other ground projects. Pak Marty, is Indonesia have enough ammo or resources to manage these tensions and bring welfare to country and the region? What is the critical success or factor to make it happen? And when the tension gets big, and how Indonesia try to mediate the tensions, perhaps? Please, Pak Marty.
Well, thank you very much. A very simple point, first of all, is that obviously Indonesia's development of Indonesia's economy, its prosperity, requires interaction globally. There is a need for foreign direct investment, for commerce, etc. So there is no option of becoming to self-exclude ourselves from global dynamics. Globalization is here to stay. We are part of the global community, etc., etc. So that is, I think, a fact of life. But the point that I'm trying to drive home just now today is that in making our decisions on specific issues, for instance, on infrastructure, huge infrastructure projects, and this and that, aside from the issue of availability of credit, availability of interest and investment, and governance issues. It would be helpful, it would be quite wise, I think, to also interject geopolitical considerations, because these things matter. And so that we are fundamentally aware what the potential risks that we need to manage, that we shouldn't allow a sets of individual decisions to take place independently from one another. And then when they are brought together, suddenly we find ourselves overly dependent on one party over the rest of the party. So I think having geopolitical consideration becomes important so that we know how to have a good mix. What is the mix between investment from country A, country B, country C, rather than simply allowing these things to happen by itself, by themselves. If you just allow things to happen by themselves, suddenly driven by availability of credit, availability of interest, investment interest, suddenly you can find your economic tatanan economy, your economic footprint or economic conditions skewed to one side over the other. And that's why I think we need to take into account these considerations. It is not about economics only, as I was saying. For instance, the One Belt, One Road of China. Now there is a competing program from NATO, from the G7 at the summit in the UK, come up with their own infrastructure plan. So we can't pretend that these are only economic and financial motivation. There's always geopolitical considerations behind it, and we need to know. We need to familiarize ourselves with this reality and not be smart after event, and only after something happens then we say, oh, we shouldn't have allowed this to take place. This is what I'm trying to encourage all of us to think about. I'm not saying geopolitics is the most important consideration. Probably it's number whatever down the list, but we need to have the habit of thinking about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Pak Marty. I think after this, we have Mbak Desya as the last person to deliver her questions because of time constraint. Mbak Desya, if you may, you may deliver your question.
Thank you, Mas Dio. Is my voice audible?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Perfect. Good morning, Pak Marty. Good morning, friends. Thank you so much. First and foremost, I'd like to convey my impression that I would love to be part of this ongoing conversation, Pak. Please allow me to line of thought. It's really like a great narrative for us, the Indonesian future leaders, in any case. So actually, I have engaged with one conversation about what is actually a more solid global cooperation and collaboration to address global issues. Because as you mentioned, in the 21st century, there is no such things that is disconnected. Everything is just interrelated, and we need to see it through the lens of oneness. So one of the idea that has been shared on that conversation is that it's a matter of capacity between countries. So, okay, the realization of this cooperation in one case may happen into like a competition instead of cooperation. So I would like to hear your thought, Pak, about this capacity. What do you think the capacity that we need to have as a country? Because I noticed from your sharing just now that you mentioned about a narrative, understanding ourselves in this whole constellation, like local, national, international, interconnectedness, the issue of governance. So what would be the capacity in this case, in your opinion? That's my question. Thank you so much, Bapak.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm pleased to if through our conversation, I'm encouraging you to think more about the subject matter. As I was saying, the purpose of a platform of this type, I think, is not necessarily to provide answers. Is basically to identify questions and problems, because the impact of a question-inducing activity is far more long-term than simply being given answers. Because I don't pretend to have any answers, but I have lots of questions in my mind. And when I heard what you said, and just now when you spoke, parts of what you said I couldn't quite hear because there was some breakage in the audio. But I'm reminded of the idea of multilateralism. I mean, multilateralism is something that we all, constantly pay homage to, constantly say that we support, and we speak of the need, reminder of how issues such as the pandemic reminds that issues that defy national solutions, requires global partnership, etc., etc. But that's a rhetoric. In reality, eventually, countries tend to look after themselves first. It is a very nation first, not recognizing the idea, the solution, the reality that no one is safe until everyone is safe. This is the pandemic. Is that way? You can't. It's not. You can't put up a wall and say, oh, you can limit people's movement. Of course we can, and we must as sovereign entities. But challenge of this type are transboundary and transnational in nature. And in the end, despite the obvious need for multilateral approach, many countries chose first and foremost the national approach first. So I think it would be wonderful if I was someone thinking about these matters of a young predisposition, future generation. I would ponder, what do we mean in the 21st century about multilateralism? Imagine yourself, if you were a delegation to the San Francisco summit of 1945 that chart the UN Charter, except it's today. Would you come up with the same type of modality and mechanism? I don't know, because I'm reminded, the pandemic for me is a reminder, for instance, that security is human. It's human security, first and foremost. Of course, you speak of national security, state security, but ultimately, first and foremost, is your own security. Security in terms of health, well-being, economic security, environmental security. So when I recognize that fact, then I realize the limitation of state, keterbatasan negara, that many of the problems and solutions requires all sectors to be involved. There is no magic wand. Tidak ada satu tongkat ajaib that someone can simply issue a keputusan, a declaration, keputusan. Suddenly everything becomes perfect. It requires engagement and participation, and that's why I hope, back to the question that someone asked at the beginning, when you speak of coordination, interdepartmental coordination, etc. Yes, there is lots of problems, challenges, even of the traditional type, of the type involving only within state governmental structures. But if we are about to solve that problem, I would suggest to make the issue even wider than that. It shouldn't be simply, because even if you get a perfect coordination modality, decision-making modality within government, within state institutions, it will only be a sub-part of the bigger picture. All the problems that we have ahead of us, the environment, the economy, etc., requires non-state stakeholders involvement. Hence, when I speak of multilateralism before, how do you, it's an ism. It's multilateralism. Ism means it is a mindset. It's a perspective. It is how you view things, how you feel about things. And this must be imbued to all of us, that actually the problems that we face requires a common approach, common security, common prosperity. These are, to me, important ideas and values in the 21st century. Again, it is not for my people like me. I mean, I tried to do my bit before. I'm trying to make myself constantly relevant now in my different capacities with the United Nations. I work with I contribute to the UN discussion on this with the Secretary General, etc. But first and foremost, it is the future generation. You must empower yourself on these issues. And I hope through this platform, at least in the geopolitical domain and the economy, etc., I'm giving encouragement that these are matters that shouldn't be left for others to simply think about and decide. They are relevant. You can make a difference, and never underestimate your capacity to make a difference. I did mention about humility, of course, that is a very important quality, but at the same time, you must ready yourself to contribute. And what a wonderful platform this is to be able to share. And I hope I can continue this conversation with the assistance of the School of Government and Public Policy. Thank you very much, Padio.
Thank you very much, Pak Marty and colleagues. Thank you very much. It's already 10:30. If we are now today in the same platform, of course, we would like to give a round of applause to Pak Marty for his thoughts, his sharing, and his experience with regard to the Indonesian diplomacy during his office, and even right now, his valuable thoughts in the changing geopolitical shift. Apologies for colleagues that we are not able to entertain to all questions. We have a very limited amount of time. And after this, I'd like to close the session. But if I may, Pak Marty, we would like to hear just one last point from your side. We are here at SGPP, School of Government Public Policy. We come from different backgrounds. Of course, there's diplomat, there's lawyer, there's also colleagues working in the CSOs. How do we take into account and practically wise, you discuss about leadership? How do we contribute ourselves? We are not from the foreign minister, from ministry. We are not within the government, perhaps. And how do we take into account all the aspirations and the thoughts and with regard to the leadership of Indonesia in the global affairs? Just a very short and brief one.
As all of us, each of us can make a difference within our own respective cluster and environment, I believe. There is no one size fits all. There is no, you can all contribute in different ways and means. But the empowering quality is the quality of curiosity and being concerned and being driven and being inquisitive and not being passive and not simply saying that these are problems or challenges, opportunities for others to deal with. Each and every one of us, you can make a difference. And I guess you would begin from your own immediate surround and situation and see how those developments that I speak of, whether it be the geopolitics, environments, human rights, I didn't even touch that. That is one of my issues that I'm so deeply driven with, and how to make sure that they are of relevance and that you can make an impact on those issues. So I think, that's it basically. I served in the foreign ministry for some 30 years, 30 years service in the foreign ministry right after I finished university. Diplomacy is in my DNA. It is in my DNA. It's in, that has been what drives me. But upon early retirement, I took an early retirement. I find other courses, other ways of serving, other ways of engaging with other than through formal institutional engagement. So I think, I mean, there is no one size fits all. There is not a single basket for the egg for you to place the eggs. So just go for it. Be curious, be inquisitive, be humble, and assert the future. The future is for you to shape and form. It's for you to shape and form, not for previous ones. You are the one who will be left with the environment, how positive or how negative it is. If the environment is being violated against, do you need to speak up? For instance, if human rights are being violated against, do we not need to speak up? Those are some thoughts. But thank you very much for having me once again. And my apologies for not being able to respond to all the questions that I see on the chat. Maybe next time.
Terima kasih banyak Pak Marty untuk insight-nya. Sehat selalu Pak. Mungkin sebelum ditutup kita foto dulu bersama-sama untuk di screenshot. Teman-teman yang belum menyalakan kamera, monggo dinyalakan kameranya supaya semuanya terlihat. Oke. Mungkin Mas Dani bisa bantu untuk menghitung supaya pas gitu.
Oke, baik. Kita ambil gambar ya. 1, 2, 3. Sekali lagi. 1, 2, 3. Oke, terima kasih.
Oke. Terima kasih banyak, Mas.
Mohon maaf kalau seandainya ada tutur kata yang tidak pada tempatnya, dan selamat berkarya, dan insya Allah semua dalam keadaan baik-baik selalu. Terima kasih.
Terima kasih.
Terima kasih Pak Marty.
Terima kasih Pak Marty.
Mungkin terakhir.
Thank you Pak Dio.
Mungkin terakhir dari teman-teman SGPP pakai bahasa Indonesia saja ya. Ada 2 yang ingin diperkenalkan. Aktivitas pertama Introduction to Research Writing, fasilitatornya bagi teman-teman yang tertarik salah satu dosen kami di SGPP Pak Novi gitu. Acaranya tanggal 30 Juni 2021 hari Rabu jam 8 pagi hingga jam 12 siang. Dan ada satu lagi Mas Dani ya. Oke, yang kedua, bila teman-teman berminat untuk mengikuti copywriting for success in life and career, akan ada workshop diadakan oleh SGPP gitu terkait dengan menulis cerdas untuk citra diri. Teman-teman banyak yang mungkin tertarik untuk membangun citra diri di dunia sosial media sekarang yang sangat memberikan banyak aspirasi gitu. Dan kita gimana cara membangun citra diri kita supaya sesuai dengan apa yang diminta oleh society di sekitar kita. Nah, acaranya tanggal 25 Juni 2021, hari Jumat, jam 8.30 sampai jam 11.30. Pendaftarannya ada di event.sgpp.ac.id. Saya kira itu dari saya mohon maaf jika dalam memoderasi tadi ada kesalahan dan tutur kata yang tidak pas. Mohon maaf juga karena tidak bisa mengentertain semua pertanyaan yang masuk karena limitasi waktu. Untuk teman-teman yang sudah menyaksikan via YouTube maupun teman-teman yang hadir di Zoom, kami mengucapkan terima kasih dan juga tentunya sehat-sehat selalu, kasusnya makin naik, jaga protokol kesehatan. Oke teman-teman, saya tutup ya, terima kasih.
Terima kasih Mas Dio, terima kasih semua.
Thank you semuanya.